magnetize your minis, flight stands, custom kits, and all the hobby supplies you'll need from themagnetbaron.com.
Hello and welcome to the YouTube channel for Craftworld.Eldar.com. I'm Brent, and this is part one of a comprehensive review of the Craftworlds portion of the new 9th edition Aeldari Codex. Now, if you haven't already watched my first thoughts video, you might have a look at that one first. That is a sort of broad brushstrokes overview of how Space Elves have changed in 9th edition, and it goes into detail about the new faction bonuses, the new battle focus rules, Strands of Fate, Sudden Assault. So in this video, I'm going to be focused on the new Subfaction bonuses. So I'm going to talk about all of the major craft worlds and then about the Far-Flung Craftworld options. And in later videos, I will discuss all of the other rules. We'll move on to stratagems, relics, and warlord traits, and possibly secondaries, and then work our way through the data sheets. And by the end of the week, we'll be through the whole book. So the mainstream craft worlds all got a major makeover, and they are all much, much better. They're both competitively much stronger, and they, I think, much better embody the fluff on the table, which I personally appreciate. That's an important part of the game to me. And the other thing that I like is the bonuses, for the most part, will support a wide variety of playstyles and benefit the vast majority of the units in the army. And one of the things that I think was frustrating about the subfaction bonuses in the old Codex, for example, if you were a Biel-Tan player, unless you're taking a whole bunch of shuriken weapons, you feel like your Biel-Tan army is giving something up and is sort of subpar. And it was particularly tragic because Biel-Tan was supposed to be all about aspect warriors. But what's really cool about this is that the subfaction bonuses for each of the craft worlds, except Saim-Hann, we'll talk about that, really does benefit pretty much all your units, and so it supports a wide variety of playstyles, which is really exciting. Okay, we'll start with Ulthwe, because that's chronologically first in the book. I think, hands down, Ulthwe is one of the very best picks right now for Craftworld Eldar. Their attribute, Foresight of the Damned, is actually 4 bonuses, not 1 bonus, and all of these are good. All of these open up interesting synergies and will benefit pretty much any army that you could field, regardless of whether or not it's competitive. So the first one is, each time a unit with this attribute is selected to shoot or fight, you can reroll the wound roll when resolving that unit's attack. So this is the second half of Expert Crafters, which a lot of us were leaning into in 8th edition. It's really good. It's not quite as good as rerolling the hit roll, for the simple reason that the weapons for which you want the rerolls the most tend to be more likely to wound than to hit. Most of the time, they tend to be very, very high strength. But that's not always the case, you know, especially against a high toughness target. Something like a Bright Lance might actually benefit more from the wound roll. So there's that. But it's just solid, right? I mean, it certainly rewards MSU style play. That is smaller units with bigger weapons. So, you know, you might think if you're playing Ulthwe, if you're running 3, say, support platform D cannons, you're better off than running a single unit of 3. Those singletons would all benefit. That's the thing that we were doing with Expert Crafters. I'm actually not sure this is going to turn out to be true for reasons that I'm going to go into, but it certainly does reward those MSU style builds if you want to keep playing that way, a way that we were all playing quite a lot in 8th edition. Those rerolls are just solid. They're great. It's so good. The second attribute for Foresight of the Damned is that each time you take a psychic test for a psyker unit with this attribute, if it's the first psychic test taken for that unit, add 1 to the result. This is so good. It makes psychic powers so much more reliable. A lot of the psychic powers, too, that we're going to want to, I think, lean into the most are actually warp charge value 6, which is really nice. The new Will of Assyrian, or Assyrian, I'm not quite sure how we're saying that, despite being a 20-year Eldar veteran. That power is so good, and at a essentially a warp charge value of 5 now, you're very, very likely to succeed without having to use a reroll. And if you do use a reroll, it's all but certain. And so simply having reliable psychic powers, which makes sense for Ulthwe, is a big deal. You can plan your tactics with much greater emphasis on psychic powers succeeding than if you have to, always worry that that's not going to be the case. And if you also use something like Focus Will to give +2 to the casts of, say, your Farseer, you can guarantee that unless you get denied, and it's going to be hard for an opponent to deny, because if you're casting Focus Will and you're getting that bonus to at least the first power, the most important one, at +3. If I roll 2d6 and add +3, my average roll's a 10. It's going to be difficult for you to deny. Also, a lot of the psychic powers are enhanced by some way now. If you roll high, usually that enhancement is increased range. So all of the psychic powers that used to be 24 inches are now 18 inches, but they go back to 24 inches if you roll a 9 or better. And some of them, like Mind War, also have some other benefit. If you roll high, they do more damage, or they're harder to deny. So more valuable casts, or more likely casts, that's a super powerful bonus. The next one, models with this attribute have a 6+ invulnerable save. So we lost the 6+ feel no pain from before, and we went to a 6+ invuln save, and that might actually seem like a come down, but with the new rules, bizarrely, it isn't, for the simple reason that Strands of Fate is a thing. So if you haven't watched my last video, or you haven't gotten your Codex in the mail or whatever, Strands of Fate is the faction bonus that lets you roll a bunch of dice before each battle round, and then each of those numbers corresponds to an auto roll of a 6 for a certain kind of die roll. And there are ways to manipulate those dice. You can watch my other video if you're interested. So knowing that all of your units, not just your Aspect Warriors, but all of your units have a 6+ invuln save, means that you can use any 6s you roll for Strands of Fate to make any unit in your army auto shrug any attack regardless of the AP. So having a vehicle that can shrug an enemy las cannon shot that when that vehicle normally wouldn't have an invuln, that's a big deal, right? I mean, that's pretty good. Oh, the other advantage to being able to reroll wounds as a matter of foresight of the damned instead of a stratagem or something is all of the reroll powers in the book now, the Autarch Aura, the psychic powers, all of them are limited to core units, so not vehicles. So your vehicles don't have any rerolls unless you're playing Ulthwe or Biel-Tan. So that ability to reroll the wound die, that's a big deal if you're planning to run any vehicles at all in your army. I guess there is actually a way to give rerolls to support platforms that we'll talk about. But for the most part, vehicles don't get rerolls unless you have a subfaction bonus that provides it. Okay, last element of Foresight of the Damned. Each time a model with this attribute loses a wound as the result of a mortal wound, you roll a d6. On a 5+, that wound is not lost. So this sounds like it doesn't really matter, because how often do you lose units to mortal wounds? But it's actually, this is huge, because one of the great vulnerabilities that Craftworlds have, their infantry are very expensive. So especially now, pretty much everything went up in the Codex, and Aspect Warriors all have an invul now, and a lot of them have other tricky ways of staying alive. Howling Banshees, you're at -1 to hit them in melee. You can, of course, use something like Lightning Fast to make any unit -1, but mortal wounds it's a way around that, right? So the ability to know that you will shrug off 1/3 of incoming mortal wounds, that is not nothing. That really is, it's in a lot of matchups, it's not going to matter that much, but when it matters, it's potentially really going to matter. Their Warlord trait is called Fate Reader. After you make a Strands of Fate roll, if the Warlord is on the battlefield, you can choose to retain 1 additional die. Now, and it says 1 additional dice here because I was for a long time under the impression that in the UK, you guys all just say dice for die, that it's singular because they do that in the 40K source books, and because somebody told me that, a British friend whom I trusted, and then a bunch of you told me in the comments on a YouTube video that that's not true, but Games Workshop does it, so I don't know. You can retain 1 additional die. That's so good. So I think we see, right, that Ulthwe is designed to lean into Strands of Fate a bit, which from a lore perspective, as the sort of doomed super psychers of the Aeldari race, totally makes sense. So you're rolling 6 Strands of Fate dice. Each Farseer you have on the table lets you reroll 1 of those, and then if you take Fate Reader, you get to keep 5 instead of 4, and that's potentially big. It also means that if you're building an Ulthwe war host, you really need to think about including units that can make good use of a lot of different kinds of Strands of Fate role. And I think that that's one of the ways in which building Craftworlds armies is going to change, or just sort of be changed for all of us, is in order to make maximum use of what really is a pretty powerful faction bonus, we need to plan in advance how we're going to do that. So, for example, having something that's going to charge out of Deep Strike that can make use of 6s to make a charge roll. Something like maybe Wraith Blades coming out of Deep Strike. If you also cast Ghost Walk on them, now they literally can't fail a 9-inch charge unless your opponent has some kind of trick. There are a lot of weapons that if you get a natural 6 to wound, get some sort of bonus, like now D cannons, in addition to their now D6 plus 2 damage, do an extra wound if you roll 6s. Certainly stuff like Shuriken Catapults and Shuriken Cannons, that's probably going to be the sort of thing you'd more want to use it on. Rangers on 6s still deal mortal wounds. Swooping Hawks, when you roll 6s to hit, also auto wound. So having various places where you can make use of these dice, I think as an Ulthwe player will be really, really important. If you're running the Striking Scorpion Phoenix Lord, he does 2 additional mortal wounds when he rolls 6s to wound. So having him run alongside your Ulthwe army is probably not a bad idea. The Relic, the Ghost Helm of Al-Shazir. Someone's going to correct me. This one's really good. The bearer knows 1 additional psychic power from the Runes of Fortune Discipline, and each time a psychic test is taken for the bearer on an unmodified roll of 9+, the psychic power or psychic action cannot be denied. What? Especially in combination with Runes of Fate. So knowing that you can auto roll a 6 for one of your die, and then if you cast Focus Will, you can guarantee that some particular psychic cast will succeed and cannot be denied. The ability for Ulthwe to leverage the psychic game is huge. And notice that this applies not only to psychic powers, but psychic actions. This means that even against an opponent with really good psychic denial, you could lean into Warpcraft as one of your secondaries and score it pretty reliably. And I think that's, for me, that's kind of what puts Ulthwe over the edge as maybe the best. Definitely close to the top, because Craftworlds are still, even after the new Codex, it's going to be tricky to play the primary game. I think we can. We've got some great new tools for that. I talked about this a little bit in the previous video, but we also still only have 2 secondaries that are super reliable, and then the third one is a little touch and go because none of the secondaries in this book are really great. And so the ability to lean into a Warpcraft one and know that you can make it work, that is freaking huge. And that the bearer knows 1 additional psychic power. Essentially, any of your Farseers, you could have 2 Farseers that are, you could have Eldred, who we'll talk about because he's an Ulthwe character, and then some other Farseer who also has or knows 3 powers. He doesn't get an additional cast, so it's not equivalent. It's also a good way to fit, because theoretically you could give this to a Warlock character, I think, because even though Warlocks have gone to the elite slot, if you have only 1 Warlock in the unit, they gain the character keyword. So if I'm reading that right, and I might not be, I think that it would also be a way to get an extra option on a Warlock. But an extra option on a Farseer is certainly no mean thing on its own. So really good Relic. Discipline of the Black Guardians. This is the stratagem. It's 1 CP, and we're familiar with this. When you select Ulthwe Guardians to shoot or fight a single unit of them, each time a model in that unit makes an attack, you add 1 to the hit roll. And then I'll point out that there is also a stratagem that allows Guardian units to reroll 1s. And so in an Ulthwe army, you could have a Guardian unit hitting on 2s and rerolling 1s. So good. Not only is it good for that big Guardian blob coming in out of the webway, but it's also good for Wind Riders and for support platforms. both of which now have the Guardian keyword. Also, Wind Riders have a 3-up save. They're much better. And Shuriken weapons have better range and a native -1 AP, and they still go to -3 on 6s to wound. So there's a lot of play here. But I personally am excited about a unit of 3 D cannons that hit on 2s and reroll 1s. And this is why I say that initial Ulthwe trait where you get to reroll 1s to wound, you might initially think, oh, I want, maybe 3, because the D cannons have been very efficiently pointed this time around, given the increase to their potency. So you might be thinking, oh, it would be most advantageous to run singletons of those to max the rerolls. But I think actually because of these 2 stratagems, you are better off running a unit of 3 and then enhancing them in other ways. So that's all pretty freaking good. The other nice thing about Discipline of the Black Guardians is even though Craftworlds have gotten across the board a big boost, I still think our troops slot is not, it's not quite where we would love it to be. Guardians got more range and they got better AP, but they might still be like 1.2 expensive. Rangers are good for sure. They have a lot of play. But I think where we typically are going to want to be with those is 2 units, unless you're playing Alaitoc, and 3 units may be not totally ideal. And Storm Guardians have all kinds of problems. So one of the nice things about this is it makes if you do have some Guardians at Deep Strike, it makes that 3rd troops unit feel a little bit less like attacks than it might under different circumstances. So Ulthwe are great. Just so many opportunities to make better use of Strands of Fate than other factions, to bring psychic leverage to the table, and they just have rerolls that benefit the whole army. They're working on a lot of fronts here. And lastly, their special character. Eldred is still really good. He's the Eldred that we love, we know and love with a couple of changes. One, he no longer has the 3-up invuln, but he's got the 4-up invuln and he has transhuman. So wound rolls of 1 to 3 always fail against him. And although normal Farseers have all lost their 1 free reroll, Eldred has gained free rerolls for all of his casts, and he still can attempt to manifest 3 powers, and he still knows 3 powers, although he can only deny 2. So he's still great. It's still tricky always with infantry Farseers to move them around, but I also think that because of the way the book has changed, we're going to see Farseers in less of a aggressive role and more of a support role, and so it won't be such a big deal to have him in your backfield to the front of, / the front of your midfield. You won't necessarily need him super forward. So he's still really good, and he's expensive at 145, but probably worth it. So Ulthwe's great, lots of play opportunities, super good. Craftworld Alaitoc, also strong. Not quite. I think that there are 3 that are top tier, and this one doesn't quite get there for me, but I do think it's very good. And I think in most matchups, it will be as good as the other 3. But for reasons that I will go into, I think that Alaitoc might not be as consistent as Ulthwe, Biel-Tan, and even Iyanden. But nevertheless, they're really good. So the Alaitoc attribute is Fieldcraft. Each time a ranged attack is made against this unit with this attribute, if the attacker is more than 12 inches away, the unit with this attribute is treated as having the benefit of light cover. So that's +1 to your saving throw. And that affects everything in your army. So if you keep the opponent at range, you have some extra durability. In addition, if the model being targeted is an infantry or biker unit and at least 12 inches away, it also gets the benefits of dense cover, and that's -1 to hit. So your infantry and bike units, if they are more than 12 inches away from your opponent, will get +1 to their saving throws and -1 to hit. And because Eldar struggle with durability, that is obviously a big deal. Now, if you're running Alaitoc Rangers, you may remember that Rangers get an additional +1 to their saving throw when they have the benefit of cover. So your Rangers will go from having a 5-up save to having a 3-up save and being -1 to hit. Essentially, you get your old Rangers back from back when Rangers were really good in 8th edition. But Rangers are a little bit better now, so they're even better than those 8th Ed Rangers. Well, sort of. You still can't stack all of the -1s to hit to make them nigh on impossible to kill. So in that sense, maybe not quite, but they are very good. Lastly, and this one is sneakily important, you can ignore any or all modifiers to the move characteristic of infantry units with this attribute, and you can ignore any or all modifiers to advanced rolls made for such units. Now, the reason that this is important is because of the synergy that it has with battle focus. And I talked about this in my video on first thoughts, and so I'm not going to go all the way down this rabbit hole. I'll merely say that this means that unlike everybody else, Iyanden infantry can reliably stand behind a line of sight blocking ruin to not be targeted by an enemy, and then on your turn they step into it, they shoot the enemy, and then they use their battle focus move to step out of it again and not be shot by the enemy. Battle focus, when you move into any kind of area terrain, including ruins, you get -3, which means there's a 50% chance that your unit will just fail to move out of the ruin. If you're any other craft world trying to pull this off, and Alaitoc can do it reliably, and that's huge. And it's also so fluff appropriate, right? Because that's Alaitoc's thing. They're ambushers. So being up against these Alaitoc infantry that keep popping up from behind ruins, taking pot shots, and then being totally untargetable, frustrating for an opponent, but definitely is appropriate to the Alaitoc vibe and fluff. The Warlord trait is called Master of Ambush. In your command phase, you can select an Alaitoc infantry corps unit within 9 inches of the Warlord, and essentially it can perform an action and still shoot. That's good. The action economy has become even more important. For one thing, pretty much everybody is taking some kind of secondary that requires actions. For Craftworld Eldar, it's usually going to be retrieve Nachman data. But there are also now missions in which scoring primary points requires you to perform actions. So actions are more important. And so, and we also, because we're an elite army, we tend to have fewer models on the table. That's one of the things also I covered in the last video. You're going to have fewer models than you did before in your roster. And so actions are harder to fit in, having units that are just dedicated action monkeys. So being able to have a unit multitask is super important. And so that warlord trait, that part of that warlord trait really matters. The second aspect of Master of Ambush is that it allows you to select a unit of Rangers before the first battle round, pick it up and redeploy it anywhere 9 inches from the enemy. Now, Rangers can already forward deploy. They can already be deployed in the midfield 9 inches from your enemy's deployment zone. But it's the ability to essentially phantasm a unit of Rangers for free without spending CP is really cool. Also, if you're using it in conjunction with Phantasm, you could pick up 3 units plus a unit of Rangers and just completely redeploy, which is, again, very appropriate to Alaitoc and gives you tremendous tactical flexibility. This is really going to reward people who like to fake their opponent out before the game begins. The Shift Shroud of Alan Sayre is the relic, and this makes a character unit completely untargetable outside of 12 inches while it's receiving the benefits of cover. And it will be, because all Alaitoc units outside of 12 inches get cover, unless, of course, your opponent has some ability that ignores cover. This is good, right? It's a really good way to keep, for example, some autarch who likes to stay at range with a missile launcher or something alive, because there are a lot of abilities in the game that remove cover bonuses. I'm not completely convinced by this one. I think you're still going to want an escort to run around with your autarch, but it is good for sure. And then the Alaitoc stratagem is called Pathfinder Ambush, and this is pretty cool. You can, when you're at the end of your opponent's strategic reserves, you can take Rangers that you had in strategic reserve, set them up 9 inches away from those models, and then shoot the unit that your opponent just deployed during your opponent's phase. So this has 2 functions. 1, it's just you do damage to that unit. And 2, potentially you screen something really important. When I was imagining ways in which the new Codex could be cool, and I wrote this article on my blog, and I made a video about what I would love to see in the new Codex. Maybe it was just a blog post, actually. I mentioned essentially that I thought it would be really cool if Striking Scorpions could do this. And that didn't happen, which is okay, because Striking Scorpions are amazing. But it's cool that Rangers can. and the ability to just like drop a screen wherever you need it and shoot a thing. And if you think about the new Ranger package, potentially, you bring them in, you screen with them, you shoot the thing, that thing then has to charge the Rangers. If they have the wire weave net, they take D3 mortal wounds, they're at -2 to the charge, and you can overwatch and shoot them again, and potentially use the Strands of Fate die to auto-succeed for a little bit more damage. So that's a pretty awesome combo. I think, you can also, if you already have Rangers on the table, you don't have to bring Rangers in. If you have Rangers on the table, you can select them and just use the 1-point stratagem to shoot with Rangers you already have, if you don't have anything in strategic reserve. So that's good too. A little less optimal, but still good. Before we talk about Illic Nightspear, I'll say a couple things about the types of tactics I see people leaning into with Alaitoc and why I think it might struggle in some matchups. So you're obviously going to want your Rangers are just better. So I think the 3-up the 3-up Ranger and your Rangers in your troop slot is probably an obvious auto include. And then some of you may have noticed that there is a stratagem in the book that allows you to select a unit that's within range of a Resonator Shroud unit, and the only units with the keyword Resonator Shroud are Rangers, and then your indirect fire Shadow Weaver weapons, so your Night Spinners and your support platforms get crazy bonuses against that target. And again, I mentioned before, it's really hard to give rerolls to vehicles. This is one of the only ways to do it. And so I think like a double Night Spinner build or even more, maybe 3 Night Spinners for Alaitoc could be really good. I could even imagine a situation. I think that for the most part, this book is going to emphasize infantry primarily and vehicles in more of a support role, which I think the last time around vehicles in 8th ed, vehicles definitely played a bigger role for Aeldari. And this feels more Aeldari to have Craftworld aspect warriors, for the most part, being the center of the army. But I certainly can imagine a build that involves like 3 Night Spinners and, I don't know, 9 indirect fire support platforms just wrecking the enemy. And that would be an interesting build for Alaitoc because of the synergy there. But I also think that you, if you're building an Alaitoc force, you probably want to emphasize units that are pretty fast so you can keep running away, keep staying 12 inches from your opponent to emphasize that strength. And this is also the reason why I'm not convinced that they're quite as strong as the others, is that there are going to be some matchups when you're against opponents who are just so fast that they can constantly close to within 12 inches, and then all of those bonuses melt away, and it just becomes really hard to play to the strengths of your subfaction. And that's not a thing that happens to Ulthwe or to Biel-Tan or even to Iyanden. And that's why I think that I think this is still good. I think all of these craft worlds are totally viable in real competitive play, and I think we will see all of them at tournaments, winning more than they lose. But I'm not convinced that at this point, at this juncture, I'm not convinced that Alaitoc is quite as strong as the others. But let's look at Illic. I actually think that Illic is, I haven't heard anybody yet really praise Illic. I actually think he's pretty good. He's only 90 points, which, I mean, it's a lot, but compared to the other stuff in the book, it's not that bad. And his deal is he's a super ranger character who still has the Voidbringer. It's heavy 1, and each time you select a target for the unit, you can ignore Lookout, Sir, and each time an attack is made with the weapon, an unmodified wound roll of 4+ inflicts D3 mortal wounds. And it's got a 48-inch range, and that's on top of Strength 6, AP -3, flat 3. So if you hit and wound an enemy character, you're looking at 3 flat damage plus D3 mortals. In addition, that's super good. I think that when you remember that we have access to Strands of Fate now, and you could make him auto hit and auto wound, you could just automatically make him do flat 3 plus D3. And if you combine that with the sniper fire from your other Rangers, you actually stand a really good chance of popping even pretty tough characters. The invuln saves will still be a little bit of a challenge for the flat 3 damage, but there are relatively few invulns in the game now that are better than 4+, and so it's just not bad odds, especially, again, in conjunction with fire from other ranger units. I think it's really good. You can they're core, so you could also throw guide on them, and leaning into your snipers as an Alaitoc player is something that was pretty hard to do in the last iteration of Eldar, and I think it's going to be much more viable now. And so I think he's actually got some real play. Although we have a lot of really powerful HQ options, and one of the hardest aspects of list building after this codex is going to be deciding what units get to take the most desirable slots, and HQ might actually be the most desirable slot now. But what a great problem to have, right? I mean, we're going to have units that don't quite make the cut for us that are just better than what other factions have access to at the best. We used to be on the receiving end of that, and we're not anymore, and that's exciting. So he's good, Alaitoc's solid, but I do worry that some situational matchups might be a problem. Okay, Biel-Tan. These guys are great. In my first pass, I was convinced that this was probably the number one, just edging out Ulthwe barely. And now I'm not convinced. Now I think it's probably first equal with Ulthwe. But Biel-Tan are freaking great. I have in my first 9th edition game. This is what I ran. I used a rule called Footsteps of the Ancients with my Ibrasili, and I used the Biel-Tan bonuses. We'll talk about that when we get to Custom Craftworlds. But it went really well against Custodes. I think they're awesome. So their first, their attribute, Swordwind, has 2 bonuses. And the first one is that each time you make an advance roll, you treat rolls of 1 and 2 as a 3, or if you make a battle focus move. This is pretty cool. It means your Biel-Tan units are all a bit faster. So units like, for the advanced thing, units like Howling Banshees that can advance and charge, that makes the advance and charge on your Banshees a little bit more reliable. It's especially good if you also throw Ghost Walk on them. They've lost their native +2, so we have to find other ways of getting that. And that's awesome. Also moving your Shining Spears up the board. It's anything that wants to play fast and aggressive is going to benefit from that. And then on the battle focus move, your units that are being sheepishly snipey can shoot a thing and then reliably step sideways behind cover if that option presents itself. Now, you'll notice that you still can't reliably pull the stepping in and out of ruins trick, because in battle focus moves, when you cross any kind of area terrain, including a ruin, again, you get -3. And they treat rules of 1 and 2 as 3s. So on 1s, 2s, and 3s, like any other craft world, you still just get stuck in the ruin and you don't go anywhere. Anybody can use matchless agility to get a 6 on their battle focus move and auto succeed, but that costs CP and you can only do it once. So I think when you're doing that popping in and out of cover thing, I think that it's going to be sideways, which is harder. It's harder, especially with larger units, but it's certainly still good. I think that we're also going to see this used to set up screens and guarantee that you're going to be able to get onto objectives. It's just super solid. Mobility powers for Eldar are always really good because we rely on mobility to win games. The second attribute is super easy to play and just obviously awesome. This is the first half of Expert Crafters. Every time you make an attack roll in the fight or shooting phase, a unit can reroll one of the hit dice. And so if you are running the sort of MSU, if a lot of us were running Expert Crafters and Hunters of Ancient Relics before, and so those types of units will still benefit in a big way in a Biel-Tan list. And I mentioned when I was talking about Ulthwe that faction bonuses are one of the only ways to give rerolls to vehicles. And so if you have units like Hornets or Singleton Warwalkers with double Bright Lances, which are way better now, or even Viper jet bikes with Star Cannons or Bright Lances, this is a really easy way to make those far more reliable. Also Wraith Seers. Because currently none of the Forge World stuff has gotten the new rules yet. So the data sheets on Wraith Seers, for example, they don't have the -1 damage and they don't have access to Strands of Fate. But if you did want to run a Wraith Seer, this would be a way to make that D-Cannon a little bit more reliable. I assume that we will get those updates, hopefully FAQ'd, because I love my Wraith Seers, but it's really good. It's just obviously good. There's no unit in your army, no combat unit in your army that is not going to appreciate those rerolls in a big way. It's so powerful. The Warlord trait, Natural Leader. In your command phase, you can select a friendly Biel-Tan core unit within 6 inches of this Warlord, and then you just get Guide automatically. It's Guide that can't fail. And this is what it was the last time around too, and it was so good. I think it was probably the most I think I called it the best Warlord trait in the book, maybe, in the video in which I was talking about how to play the regular Craft Worlds. It's still so freaking good. This means that there are also subtle ways in which Biel-Tan are able to keep up kind of in the psychic phase with Ulthwe, and this is one of them, right? You essentially, you could have, for example, a Farseer with this Warlord trait who has 2 casts, neither of them is Guide, but is essentially auto-succeeding on Guide also, which is really good. You obviously are going to be using this probably on larger units. 6 inches is limiting, admittedly, so even though you could use it on a Farseer, I think there's also a lot to be said for, an offensive autarch with something like this. The Relic, the Spirit Stone of Anathilim, again, someone's going to correct me. This is one of the other ways that the Biel-Tan can keep up with Ulthwe and the psychic phase. The bearer knows 1 additional psychic power from their chosen discipline, and once per psychic phase, you can re-roll 1 psychic test taken for the bearer. And so, although Biel-Tan are certainly not equivalent to Ulthwe, they're not getting +1 every time they attempt a cast. They're also not as wildly outstripped by them as they otherwise would be. And this is one of the reasons why I think this craft world is jostling for best in the book from a competitive perspective. And then for 1 CP, Wrath of the Shrines. This is so good. It's so good. It's simple, but it's solid. You choose a Biel-Tan aspect where your unit, when it's either shooting or fighting, and all of the 6s score additional hits. So your unit of striking scorpions that is jumping your opponent on turn 1, or howling banshees that are really good now, that now all of our melee units, right, have gone to 3 attacks, except for Storm Guardians, which are not good. Sorry, Storm Guardians. We'll get there. So they're rolling tons of dice, and so the odds of rolling 6s higher. And obviously, you can combine this with Strands of Fate for particularly hard-hitting weapons like Wraith Axes to guarantee that you're getting multiple hits with these hard-hitting, multi-damage weapons. It's just fantastic. I think not only are Biel-Tan one of the strongest options in the book, I think they're going to be one of the easiest to play, keeping in mind that Craft Worlds overall are going to be hard to play. They're fragile, expensive, and they depend on movement shenanigans and synergies that are easy to mess up. Although we're not as exclusively dependent on those synergies as we used to be, because the data sheets are a whole lot better. But this is just, Biel-Tan is just a super strong option, and I think it's also a great place to start if you are, feeling uncertain about how to move forward with your Craft Worlds list. And if you have some sort of non-Biel-Tan-y Craft World paint job that's, you're running Ibersil or something. I think I mentioned before in the Custom Craft World, Far-Flung Craftworlds, we're calling them now, section, there's a way to make use of the Biel-Tan rules without having to claim that your models are from Biel-Tan, and that's cool too. Iyanden. I am fascinated by Craft World Iyanden this time around because it's going to play very differently from Ulthwe and Biel-Tan, and also, frankly, from Alaitoc, and certainly from Saim-Hann. So the Iyanden thing is that they're genuinely durable now. Not just the Wraith units; everything is pretty durable. Here's the attribute. It's called Stoic Endurance. The first part is good. The second part is amazing. Each time a combat attrition test is taken for the unit, add 1 to the combat attrition test. Some people have completely dismissed this, and I think that's wrong, because it's actually pretty solid. It means that if your unit takes enough casualties to fail an attrition test 1 runs away, but unless you've lost more than half the unit, you're actually going to auto pass all of your combat attrition tests, especially if you are running larger units of aspect warriors. And I think I think some people are going to want to be doing that. I think that's not a throwaway. It's certainly not anywhere near in league with the other half of this power, but it's not a throwaway. Each time an attack is allocated to a model with this attribute, if that attack has an armor penetration characteristic of -1 or -2, worsen the characteristic by 1. This is so cool. This means that if you have a unit of Iyanden Guardians with a shuriken cannon platform in some ruins, they have a 2-up save because they can take hits on the platform, which is a 3-up save. The ruins are light cover, and so that gives you +1 to your save, so you're at a 2-up save. And then you just ignore -1 AP. So typical sort of anti-infantry small arms fire either has nothing or -1 AP, so that'll just be pinging off them on a 2+. And even stuff that's -2, they're still going to save on a 3-up against. That's so good. And it's got great synergy with anything with a native 3-up save. So Wind Riders, really good. Shroud Runners, which can actually benefit from cover, unlike most jet bikes. So there's a way to get Shroud Runners to a 2-up save, which that then just ignores -1 AP and is good against -2. That's good too. Fire Dragons, which are also toughness 4 now, 2-up save and cover, ignoring AP. Same with any of your Wraith. Obviously, they're thinking of Wraith units, right? So you can plop some Wraith cannons down in a ruin, maybe from Deep Strike. They've got a pretty good damage output with those cannons at D3+3 now, hitting just ferociously hard. And they're -1 damage, and then everything is just pinging off them with a 2-up save, and they're ignoring -1 and -2 AP. Craftworlds are typically super fragile. That's their greatest weakness, is that they're expensive and fragile. And Iyanden units just aren't, especially in cover. And the reason that I think that this durability bonus is a little bit better than the Biel-Tan one is that your opponent can't just... There are very few bad matchups for this. It's really only coming up against some sort of list in which everything your opponent have is -3 AP or better, pretty much, because they're all, like, I don't know, fast, hard-hitting melee units, like maybe some kind of Tyranid Crusher Stampede or something. But for the most part, or frankly, maybe coming up against another Craftworlds list with lots of Howling Banshees and Wraithblades or something. But for the most part, I think Iyanden is going to continue to be durable in just about any matchup, and that's big. That's exciting. I think there are going to be a lot of ways to play this. It's a little bit like the Craftworlds version of Thick City. I think definitely not as competitive as Thick City was before it got nerfed, but nevertheless really good. The Warlord trait's just fine. Each time you would lose a wound, on a 5-up you don't lose it. It's 5-up, feel no pain. And then the Relic, which is still the Citronome of Iyanden, has changed. It now adds +1 to the attack characteristics of an Iyanden Spirit Host model within 9 inches, or a unit, within 9 inches of the character carrying the thing. So if you had a big unit of, say, Wraithblades with swords or axes, you could raise their attack characteristic and just make them absolute crazy combat monsters. And if the unit is Wraith Guard, who are typically not melee, they now get battle focus. So now they can shoot and hide behind something, or shoot and move again, making them suddenly not slow. So it's a way to make your melee Wraith infantry super good and your shooty Wraith infantry a bit faster, and that's their biggest weakness, right? The Wraith infantry is that they're slow. Really good. You're probably not going to want to use this on Wraithseers and Wraith Lords. You could, but 1 extra attack on those models. The Ghost Glaive is so good now that I'm going to take that back. The Ghost Glaive is so good now that there are going to be circumstances in which it makes sense. But I do think that Wraith infantry are probably the better bet. Okay. The stratagem, guided wraith sight. So you may remember Spirit Mark was a thing from before. The Iyanden Spirit Seer, they fixed the problem with the Spirit Seer. The Spirit Seer used to only grant rerolls if the target was in 6 inches of the Spirit Seer, which was super annoying. And now, as it should always have been, the way it works is that you just need to be near the unit getting the bonus. And what guided wraith sight does is it doesn't matter how close you are. If you have an Iyanden Spirit Seer model in your army, you can treat any Wraith Host unit, Spirit Host unit, as though it were in range of that Iyanden Spirit Seer Spirit Mark ability, even if it's not. This is probably something you're going to use every single turn as an Iyanden player. Just a really easy way to give rerolls to really powerful units. So it's super good. The special character is still Prince Uriel, and I regret to report that Prince Uriel is still not that good. He's one of the only units in this book that I think didn't make the grade. He's an autarch, and autarchs are a little bit better, so he's a little bit better. But basically, he's pretty good in melee, but he struggles to move around. The problem with Prince Uriel is that every autarch you would ever want to take in your army is going to have one of the following 3 things: a jet bike, swooping hawk wings, or a warp spider jump generator. And he has his feet. And even though elves run pretty quick at 7 inches, it still just doesn't really do it. And yeah, you can deep strike him. He's got this thing where he likes to jump in with a bunch of corsairs, because although he's from Iyanden, he's a corsair prince, and that's cool. But then once he's on the table, he's kind of just stuck there. And so he doesn't really do anything interesting except this thing where when you're placing models into strategic reserves that are either Corsair or Iyanden models with him, you can have the cost for doing that, which is cool, but I really just don't see why you wouldn't take an autarch that has mobility and therefore is actually good. The Spear of Twilight no longer sucks. That's nice. It doesn't provide a penalty to him as a doomed weapon. It's strength times 2, -3 AP, flat 3 damage. But that I think that's just not enough to get him there. Maybe someone's going to prove me wrong, but I still think that Prince Uriel, at least in competitive play, he's definitely better, and he's definitely totally fine for casual games. But I think in competitive play, you probably want a real autarch. Especially now that there's a jet bike called the Sunstorm, which can make a jet bike autarch just freaking insane, which is really cool. Sorry, Prince Uriel. I'll still get you on the table at some point, but I don't think you're a competitive pick. Okay, Saim-Hann. The good news is they're better than they were before, and they're definitely viable for competitive play. Bad news is, despite being the poster elves for the 9th edition Craftworlds portion of the Codex, all of the promotional materials we saw on the front end, the Eldridge Omens box set, all of it was a Saim-Hann paint scheme. I think that this is probably the weakest, and also just not just from a competitive perspective, but from a fluff perspective, I think that they a little bit dropped the ball on this Craftworld. The signature Saim-Hann unit is supposed to be Wind Riders, and Saim-Hann Wind Riders do not benefit from the Saim-Hann trait, and Wind Riders from other Craftworlds are actually better, and that's a little bit disappointing. But there's still lots to like here, and there's a lot of good stuff that they can do. Their attribute is called Wild Host. It allows you to reroll charge rolls made for units with this attribute. That's really good, especially if you're bringing a ton of stuff in out of Deep Strike in the same turn, and so you can't, in that case, like, put Ghost Walk on this thing and use the Strands of Fate dice. If you're bringing in just so many units at once that you can't use we're elves and we make you auto-succeed on a charge trick on everybody, you need to play Saim-Hann. And I think that's going to be their thing. It's going to be sudden, overwhelming melee pressure, predominantly with Shining Spears, but also Howling Banshees and Wraith Blades. I think it's weird that Wraith Blades are one of the biggest beneficiaries of the Saim-Hann powers, but they definitely are. because the other Wild Host ability is units with this attribute are eligible to declare a charge in a turn in which they fell back. So in that sense, they're basically like Harlequins. That's really cool. I think, though, that the issue with this is that for the most part, elves are still pretty fragile. And so the notion that your elves are going to get tied up in a combat that you don't want them to be tied up in, and on your turn, you're going to want them to jump out and hit something else. I don't know. It's good for Shining Spears because Shining Spears get a bonus on the charge. So if your Shining Spears charge something and they don't kill it, and then on your opponent's turn they survive and still don't kill it, they could theoretically fall back and charge again. Or I guess if your opponent had like one crappy infantry unit left and you really wanted to hit something more juicy, they could peel away and hit that. But I think this is going to be end up being more situational than it might otherwise appear, except maybe for Wraithblades, which are so durable that it's reasonable to suppose that they could hang in combat for a few turns and then want to run and hit something else. I mean, it is good for the charge bonus for the Shining Spears. I'm probably underselling it, but I think that what the other Craftworlds got is so good. I kind of want them to have something more situational. And whereas the bonuses that everybody else got benefits every single unit in the army, the Wild Host bonuses only benefit units that want to charge into melee and will survive multiple turns of melee and will want to reallocate their resources elsewhere. And that ends up being a narrower band of units in a more situational band. And those powers are then not so amazing that, for my money, it counterbalances the loss of bonuses that benefit the whole army. To put it another way, it seems that if your Craft World bonus only benefits a very narrow band of units, it needs to be such a good bonus that you're not giving something up, really, by getting nothing for everything in your army that doesn't do the thing. And I just don't see that here, really. But nevertheless, the overwhelming melee pressure move, I think that's going to work really well for them. And if that's your playstyle, if that's what you like, I think these guys are a great pick. They have a cool warlord trait. It's called Wild Rider Chieftain. You add 1 to the warlord's attack characteristics, and that warlord can perform heroic interventions within 6 inches horizontally and 5 inches vertically, 3 inches horizontally and 5 inches vertically. And each time you do this, when you perform a heroic intervention, you can move 6 inches instead of 3 inches. That's great. I once lost a tournament game simply because I didn't know that my opponent's character could do this, and I was actually making a move that was just like a fluff funny move. It was late in the game, and it was stupid, but it can be super powerful, and I really like the idea of a like jet bike autarch on the Sunstorm who's just a ridiculous combat monster, elf, Plains of Saim-Hann, bike Akira Kurosawa Jedi thing guy. I don't know. Super cool. Both fluffy and good. The relic is called the Talisman of Tyan Kar, and each time the bearer makes a melee attack, if you made a charge move or heroically intervened this turn, you add 1 to the strength and 1 to the damage characteristics and improve the armor penetration by 1. And you can see immediately how that has good synergy with the warlord trait. The obvious move here is to give your warlord both of those and have it just be a super cool combat monster. And that's great. There are ways to turn jetbike autarchs from other Craftworlds also into combat monsters. And Saim-Hann might not actually be the very best at this, but they're very, very good at it. And I really can't imagine a Saim-Hann list that doesn't include that model because it's super powerful. Okay, the stratagem, Warriors of the Raging Winds. Use the stratagem at the end of your charge phase, select 1 Saim-Hann biker unit from your army, and until the end of the phase, that unit is eligible to declare a charge even if it advanced. Again, this is all about biker units that want to charge, which is really only Shining Spears and maybe an autarch on a bike. So your Viper jet bikes and your Wind Riders, the signature Saim-Hann units, are all left in the dust by this. I guess Maybe not. There's probably a circumstance in which your MSU Windrider unit really needs to tag an opponent's vehicle or something, and you pull this out. But for the most, it's obviously intended, right? Because now Shining Spears, because Quicken can no longer be used to double move a unit and then charge, that means that T1 Blitz with the Shining Spears used to be able to move 32 inches and then jump something. And with Saim-Hann Shining Spears, you could even advance and do it. And that's gone. So this is a way of trying to, I think, compensate for some of that. So theoretically, you significantly increase the threat range of your Shining Spears, even on turn one. And especially with judicious use of Phantasm, you put your spears at the front of your deployment zone. If you then don't get first turn, you can move them. But you stand a pretty good chance, certainly if you do get first turn, of being able to cross the board with your spears, succeed on a charge, especially with Ghost Walk, and maybe some runes or Strands of Fate dice. You can probably get them there. So you can still, if you're running Saim-Hann, you can still blitz with your spears, and that's cool. They're good. They're mobile. Sudden overwhelming melee pressure from multiple directions. They're good at that. But for me, I think this is probably the least competitive of the mainstream Craftworlds. And I think it's exciting that it's nevertheless still competitive, in part because the datasheets are so good. The datasheets are so good this time around. And when we get to datasheets, we'll talk about why. But so don't despair, Saim-Hann players. I think that you can still do well in tournaments. I think that you can still beat the hell out of the Monkai at your local club. I think you're really not going to have a problem. I think that it's just compared to the other Craftworlds, if you were looking to optimize with competitive play in mind, I do think the other ones probably have a little bit of an edge, except maybe in one narrow build where you jump them with everything at once, and that's probably what Saim-Hann players are going to lean into, and it'll be okay. Okay, Far-Flung Craftworlds. I am, again, as an Iversol player, I am super excited about this section. So here's my overarching opinion of the Far-Flung Craftworlds. There some of these combos. So it works exactly like it did before. If you're bringing a Craftworld to the table that doesn't have rules like Iversol, you can select 2 traits from this list and make your own custom rules. Now, obviously, there are things that you lose when you do this. There's no custom stratagem. There's no custom relic. There's no custom warlord trait. And so you're giving something up. And I would say that for the most part, these combos, the majority of these combos probably are not quite as good as at least 3 of the mainstream Craftworlds. But there are some combos here that probably are, and are probably also, even though we're not getting access to special characters and relics and stuff, probably so good that they are first equal with some of those other options. I think that overall, generally, the mainstream Craftworlds are the best. I think there are ways to use Far-Flung Craftworlds in very boutique builds that will be competitive with the mainstream Craftworlds. And I'll also say this: look, if you're coming at the game from a narrative perspective and you want to choose a couple of traits that accurately depict the vibe of the custom Craftworld you're going for, you can do that, not worry terribly about the competitive angle, and not get your butt kicked, and still have a good army. Again, because the data sheets are so solid and the stratagems are so good in this book that we're less dependent than we used to be on these subfaction bonuses, and that's cool too. And I think that for the most part, these are flavorful and well thought out, and a good combination of fluffy and also competitive at the table. I'm going to go through all of these, even though there are a lot of them, because I assume that that's what we're here for. So the first one is called Footsteps of the Ancients. Essentially, this is the one that allows you to use the subfaction bonuses, warlord traits, and special stratagems from one of the mainstream Craftworlds, but not the relic and none of the special characters for your custom Craftworld. I so appreciate this as an Iversol player. I think they even said in the old book that you could do that, but it just felt so awkward, like essentially saying that my blue guardians were Ulthwe or whatever. I like for it all to be above board and sanctioned, and I think it's reasonable that you don't get access to the relic and the special character. There should be some reward for actually having the paint scheme. But if you're planning to run, say, Biel-Tan, they don't have any special characters. You're giving up a pretty good relic, but it's pretty much all there for you, regardless of what your paint scheme is. Okay, so here are your other options. Choose two. The first one is Children of Cain. Each time a model with this attribute makes a melee attack, an unmodified wound roll of 6. On an unmodified wound roll of 6, you add 1 to the damage characteristic of that attack. I think this is good. It again, with Strands of Fate, you can sort of guarantee that you will succeed on this. But I think that there are better melee options. For one thing, that's only going to benefit you against multi-wound targets. And a lot of what your opponent has on the table may, in fact, not be multi-wound targets. It's solid, but I don't think it's as good as some of the others. And again, with wound, because you need a wound roll of 6, there's no way to, like, with Strands of Fate, like, spam that. And because it says unmodified wound roll, there's no way to cheat at it either. So, it's fine. Children of Morai-Heg. Each time a model with this attribute makes an attack, if that model's unit is below starting strength, add 1 to the attack's hit roll. This is way better than it used to be back when you had to be below half the models in the unit, which was just freaking horrid back in Phoenix Rising. But I just personally have trouble with traits that require you to have lost models, because a savvy opponent can usually play around that. They don't target a squad until they know they can eliminate it. And when you're playing against Eldar, you usually know you can eliminate the squad. I think the one exception to this is if you are running a whole bunch of, like, Wraith infantry. This might actually be pretty good, because it's pretty hard to reliably eliminate an entire squad of Wraith infantry. But again, I think there's better options here. I don't think that's going to be a terribly savvy pick for competitive play most of the time. Children of Prophecy, this one's solid. Each time a psychic test or deny the witch test is taken for the psyker with this attribute, you can reroll any or all dice results of 1 or 2. It's a way to make your custom Craftworld psychers more reliable. The role of psychic powers has definitely shifted in the game, and if you watch my video or listen, I guess, to my video, First Thoughts, you'll hear me talk about that a great deal. But nevertheless, psychic stuff is really important, and I think probably not as, like, the first Far-Flung Craftworld trait you choose as your most important one. It's probably not quite making the grade for that, but I think as a backup pick for a lot of these others, it's totally solid in a list that relies on psychic. I will say, if your list relies on psychic, you really might be better just leaning into Ulthwe with that fabulous +1, but this is still good. And also keep in mind that everybody can make use of Strands of Fate to make their psychic tests a little bit more reliable, but this is still good. Children of the Open Skies, this one's amazing. You add 1 to the move characteristic of models that can, or models with this attribute, just period, and then if it can fly, you add 2 instead of 1, and every time you make an advance roll, you treat dice rolls of 1 and 2 as a 3. So good. Your Shining Spears are faster. Your Wind Riders are faster. Your tanks, basically, your hovercraft are all faster. Your Howling Banshees, which can advance and charge, can never fail to roll at least a 3 on their advance, which makes their charges a whole lot more likely. So if you're playing, if you play a style that's very fast and relies on always being where your opponent isn't and putting overwhelming pressure on, like, one flank of your opponent's army and then darting away and doing it somewhere else, which is a very traditional way to play Eldar and historically very effective, this is just freaking great for that. I think this is one of the best picks for sure. The next one is called Diviners of Fate. Each time you make a Strands of Fate roll, if every unit in your army has this attribute, you can roll 1 additional d6. It's good. It's good. As a full half of the bonus that you get, I'm not totally persuaded. Again, all the Farseers let you reroll 1, and Ulthwe, you can keep an extra 1. I'm not sure why you might not want to just do Ulthwe, but it's solid. And again, this is like if you're not sure what your second one should be, this one's okay. Elite Citizenry. This one's pretty good. Add 1 to the leadership characteristic of models. Never a bad thing. And if you were doing the Mind War trick, again, I think Mind War, I talked about this a little bit in my first thoughts. There's a whole new way to do Mind War where you use a stratagem called Battle Psychers to let your 2 Elf Warlock Conclave both give an enemy -2 leadership and your character +2 leadership, which takes your Farseer to an 11. If you also were playing Elite Citizenry, your Farseer would have a 12, and then when it came time to do Mind War, your chances of doing like 6 mortal wounds are actually really good. But I think that whole tactic doesn't quite make the grade for competitive play, and that's definitely a niche use for this. But if you were running the Mind War combo, this wouldn't be a terrible pick. Each time a unit with this attribute is selected to fight, you can re-roll one of the hit rolls when resolving that unit's attack. So it's like mini expert crafters only in melee on the front end. In a melee heavy army that is relying on sort of MSU melee units that also has another reason to want the leadership bonus like the Mind War combo, I think that this could be a good pick. Expert Crafters is exactly what we thought it would be. It's part of Expert Crafters. You get to reroll 1 wound roll. So it's one of the things that Ulthwe has. It's solid. Again, you get so much stuff for choosing Ulthwe in addition to that. I'm not sure there's anything else here that balances such that Ulthwe is not the better pick, but it's definitely a solid addition. Rerolls are always good. Always good. Grim. Each time a combat attrition test is taken for a unit with this attribute, add 1 to the combat attrition test. Iyanden basically has that. It's good, but on its own, it's not the equal of these others. I cannot ever imagine taking that as one half of my thing. Hail of Doom. Fantastic. So good. Each time a model with this attribute makes an attack with a shuriken weapon, an unmodified hit roll of 6 automatically wounds the target and is treated as an unmodified wound roll of 6. And remember that shuriken weapons get an additional -2 to their AP on 6s, so that means that your shuriken catapults and shuriken cannons have when they hit on 6s, they automatically wound with -3 AP, and your Dire Avengers automatically wound and have -4 AP. If you are leaning into a shuriken build with a bunch of Dire Avengers, and there are so many shuriken tricks, like there's a stratagem that lets a unit of Dire Avengers below half strength shoot again. So if you had like a 10-man unit of Dire Avengers that was down to 7, they now fire 3 times. So that's 21 shots with strength 4 AP -2, firing twice to 42 shots, and all of the 6s to hit are automatically wounding with -4 AP. It's so good. And then you get some Shining Spears in there. They have catapults. You get some Wind Riders in there. This could potentially be part of a monstrous build in combination with Doom, right? Where you're also re-rolling wound rolls on those catapults for all of those that didn't just auto wound. Suddenly targets that are like T7 can just get wrecked by your catapults. It's potentially awesome in a boutique shuriken build. And again, I think that's what we're seeing with the Far-Flung Craftworlds options. If you want to lean into a very specific boutique build, there's a way to use a couple of these traits to make that work. Headstrong. You can reroll advanced rolls and charge rolls made for units with this attribute. It's essentially part of what Saim-Hann have, and we've talked about that. In a melee build, maybe that's what you'd want, but I think there are probably better options here. Again, if what you want to do is bring a whole bunch of units out of Deep Strike at once to overwhelm somebody in one turn with overwhelming melee engagement, in combination with another melee option from this page, this is a great pick. And it might even be better than using Saim-Hann to do that, honestly. But unless that's your plan, there are better options. Hundreds of Ancient Relics. While a unit with this attribute is performing an action, that unit can shoot without that action failing. Good, but there are other ways to make units do that. Will of Assyrian does that, the psychic power. And given that we have other ways to do it, I'm not totally convinced. Because you probably don't have more than one unit performing an action per turn, certainly not more than 2. And because we already have a way to make one unit do that. I think as a faction bonus, it's just not worth taking. Masterful Shots. Each time a model with this attribute makes a ranged attack, the target does not receive the benefits of light cover against that attack. It does not also get rid of dense cover, but this is good. It's very solid. It worked well for us before. It will work well for us again if you have a shooty army that wants to maintain distance from the opponent. Masters of Concealment. Each time a ranged attack is made against a unit that's more than 12 inches away, you get light cover, so you get +1 to your saving throw. That's, the Alaitoc thing. Again, it's good. It's going to struggle against opponents that close fast, but it's a way to add durability to your army. You may just want to take Alaitoc if this is what you're leaning into. But if there's some other trait here that works better for exactly the build you have in mind, then it's a totally solid pick. Mobile Fighters. Each time a model with this attribute makes an attack, if that model is unit disembarked from a transport, add 1 to the attack's wound roll. I am not sure about this one. So Falcons have gotten a lot better. They're drop pods now. You can stuff a bunch of Fire Dragons or Dire Avengers into a drop pod Falcon, bring it in even turn 1, 9 inches from an opponent, have them jump out, shoot the thing. I think that if you've got like 2 Falcons full of Fire Dragons, or maybe 1 full of Fire Dragons and 1 full of something like Banshees, and you have a Wave Serpent full of something, then this is probably not a bad pick. There's probably a boutique way to make this work really well. I have never loved bonuses that work for 1 to 3 units on only a single turn, providing +1. In theory, it could swing the whole game in your favor. Maybe it's just that it doesn't appeal to my play style, but I'm not totally sold on this one. But I'm also not confident that I'm not wrong about that. Savage Blades. This is good. Each time a model with this attribute makes a melee attack, if that model's unit performed a charge move or was charged or performed a heroic intervention this turn, improve the armor penetration of the attacks by 1. Okay, so if you are tripling down on striking scorpions, if you were starting 3 striking scorpions 9 inches from your opponent's deployment zone, or maybe 3 units of them and the Phoenix Lord, although Phoenix Lords don't benefit from subfaction bonuses. So forget I said that. The 3 units of scorpions, and your plan is if you don't get first turn, you're going to use Phantasm to just pick them up off the board. And if you do, you're going to bum rush your opponent and maybe drop some Banshees and Falcons and have them get in there too. Then Savage Blades is a great pick because Scorpions are really good now. They still don't have quite the armor penetration we would like them to have. This will obviously also benefit your Shining Spears, your Howling Banshees, your Wraith Blades. But all of those units have pretty good AP already anyway. There's very few armor values that they won't just go straight through anyway. So I really think that the only reason to consider using Savage Blades in your list is if you're leaning into Scorpions in a big way. But Scorpions are so good now that I think in competitive play, it might be reasonable to lean into Scorpions in a big play. So if that's what you're doing, this is a good pick. And then you'll also want to include other units in your army that will also benefit. But the Scorpions really are the place where this is going to shine. Swift Strikes. This one is freaking good. In your shooting phase, each time a unit with this attribute is selected to shoot, unless that unit fell back this turn until the end of phase, it counts as having remained stationary. Wow. If I'm reading this right, this means that you can make advance moves even with units with heavy weapons and shoot at no penalty. So not only could you move with something like a unit of Dark Reapers, which no longer ignore the hit penalties, shoot at no penalty. You could also do it with Rangers because those rifles are heavy weapons. But you could also make an advance move and not only shoot, but shoot at no penalty. If you are running some sort of high mobility army with vehicles with heavy weapons on them, or really that's where you want to lean into. But if it also has things like Reapers or Rangers, this is great. It's going to hugely benefit Hornets. It gives fast Craftworlds vehicles even greater mobility. And this is a place where I could imagine actually using something like Expert Crafters. If you want to run a vehicle-heavy army and there are not a lot of ways to give rerolls to vehicles, potentially this is a moment. This is your moment, right? If you want that build with all the Vipers and all the Hornets that just keeps disappearing to different sides of the table, putting the hurt on your opponent. It's super good. Again, it's geared towards a very boutique style of play, but it's a very powerful style. Okay, Students of Vol. Each time an attack with a damage characteristic of 1 is allocated to a vehicle model with this attribute, add 1 to any armor saving throws made against that attack. Not good. It's just not good. Because if you're running Iyanden, not just your vehicles, but everything gets a good bonus, and it doesn't matter what the damage characteristic is. And if you're running something like Ulthwe, you can use Strands of Fate to lean into. I don't know. It's just, I can't imagine taking this. Superior Shurikens. Add 3 to the range characteristic of Shuriken weapons. If you're doing a super Shuriken build with Hail of Doom, you may want to consider this. But I will say that now that Shuriken weapons all have better range, this might not be necessary. But again, Shuriken heavy build, and you're trying to keep your distance from your opponent, it might be worth thinking about. Vengeful. I like this one. Each time a model with this attribute makes an attack roll with a melee weapon, an unmodified hit roll of 6 scores 1 additional hit. I actually think this is great. If you're running Howling Banshees or Wraith Blades, it's essentially, you may remember Supreme Disdain. This is better than Supreme Disdain. Supreme Disdain costs you 1 CP, and it just gave you extra rolls to hit. This gives you auto hits, and it's for all of your melee units all the time. If you're running a melee build, if you're running a custom craft world and you're leaning into lots of Banshees and maybe a couple of units of Scorpions, I think that this is very solid, and I like it better than Savage Blades because I think it broadly benefits all of your melee infantry, whereas the other one only benefits Scorpions. I guess you could just go whole hog and choose both of them. But I think I would probably rather have something like, if I'm leaning into a melee build like that, something like Headstrong. Warding Ruins. Models with this attribute have a 6+ invuln save, and they have a 5+ save against mortal wounds. This one is much better than it initially appears. So you essentially get the other part of the Ulthwe thing. Ulthwe can do this. They have a 6+ invuln, and they shrug mortal wounds on a 5+. And I've already explained how with Strands of Fate, if you know everything in your army has a 6+ invuln, everything in your army can shrug anything using a Strands of Fate dice roll of a 6. It's really powerful. It's really good. And if you're looking for a durability bonus, that's solid. And we've already talked about why a 5+ save against mortal wounds is super good for Eldar. So again, I think that this is going to make sense. But like a lot of what's here, I mean, if you look, like Warding Runes and Expert Crafters, if those were your picks, you would get some of the Ulthwe stuff, but you would still be leaving other Ulthwe bonuses on the table. And so again, you've really got to be leaning into a very narrow boutique build in order for these traits to be better or as good as the standard craft worlds they can be, but you've really got to be building for it. Webway Warriors. When a reinforcement unit with this attribute is set up on the battlefield for the first time at the end of the turn, each time a model in that unit makes an attack, an unmodified roll of 6 scores an additional hit. So it works a little bit like Vengeful, but it works on shooting also, but it only works on units coming out of Deep Strike. I assume that applies to units inside of Falcons that jump out. If your plan is to overwhelm your opponent in a single turn with Deep Strikers, like 2 units of Fire Dragons in drop pods, and maybe you've got a bunch of... The only things that Deep Strike CP free now, I think, are Scorpions and Swooping Hawks and the Phoenix Lord. And Warp Spiders do hit hard now, so potentially there's a play here where you're just bringing in overwhelming pressure. I don't love it, but again, I've already acknowledged that I have a personal bias against this kind of thing that only works for specific units on a single turn, and it's like 2 or 3 units in your army. So I'm probably underselling it. I think there are ways to use it, but I wouldn't lean into it personally. Wrath of the Dead. This is good, and if you want a custom craft world Wraith build that's not Iyanden, this might be an auto take. So Wraith construct units, excluding aircraft units with this attribute, are eligible to perform heroic interventions as if they were character units. So that's all of your Wraith Blades and Wraith Guard, your Wraith Lords, your Wraith Seers. It's so good on a Wraith Seer. Wraith Seers, because they like to stay out of the fray until late game while using the indirect fire and putting down their psychic buffs, are often good babysitters for a fragile character. And so if something tries to like bum rush your fragile character, your Wraith Seer can jump up in and mess it up. If you're leaning into a Wraith heavy army, this could be very, very powerful. It would take a skilled player, and Wraiths are very expensive, so you're at a low model count, and that's its own kind of tricky. But there probably is a lot of play for this. I will point out that currently it doesn't benefit Wraith Knights because, well, unless you have 3 of them, because as far as I know, unless I've missed something, heavy Auxilia detachments still do not benefit from subfaction bonuses, which means if you have a single Wraith Knight in your army, even though Wraith Knights have gotten a lot better, they don't get the Iyanden bonus, they don't get this fun Wraith bonus. I really feel like, at least for Aeldari, that rule needs to go away. It just doesn't make sense to me. Wraith Knights have gotten a lot better, but I need for them to be able to benefit from subfaction bonuses, I think, to want to use, to want to seriously consider using them in competitive play. When we get to data sheets later, we'll do a big deep dive on the Wraith Knight data sheet. But sadly, it's not going to work for your Wraith Knights. Okay, so that's what I've got. Lots of great options here. I am so excited for all of the major craft worlds. Even Saim-Hann bringing up the rear, I think really has some play and is fun and interesting and mostly thematic, except for the Wind Rider thing. And a bunch of those Far-Flung Craftworld options are good too. There's so much depth in this codex. There are going to be so many different ways to build a list. And I think that's maybe my favorite aspect of the new subfaction rules, is that, with, again, Saim-Hann aside, none of the major craft worlds are forcing you into a particular build. Alaitoc, a little bit. It's pushing you towards rangers and night spinners and fast things that like to stay at distance. But that's a lot of stuff in the Craft Worlds Codex. And the other 3, Ulthwe, Biel-Tan, and Iyanden, both have just tremendous variability and viable lists. And that is so exciting. In my own experience, Craft World players tend to be people who love theory crafting. We love the challenge of working with something that's a bit expensive and a bit fragile, and then finding sort of crazy synergies that will make those models optimal on the table, and then get to feel really good about ourselves, which is very Aeldari. And this book is going to enable us to do that for years. So that's it. I'll be back with part 2, hopefully tomorrow, in which I will talk about warlord traits, stratagems, and probably also secondary missions and relics. And then we'll dive into data sheets. If you have not yet subscribed, I hope that you will consider subscribing. If you liked this video, I hope you will consider clicking like. And if you have your own ideas about the new subfaction bonuses, please leave those in the comments below. Thanks, guys. That's it. I look forward to seeing you next time.